In 1903, Chicago's Iroquois Theater went the way the Titanic would go 9 years later. On the afternoon of December 30th, the absolutely fireproof 5-week-old building was filled with families eager to watch Mr. Bluebeard, starring Eddie Foy. The atmosphere was one of fun, excitement, and laughter. Unfortunately, the laughter quickly turned to terror when a spark from an arc light brought down a fiery curtain shortly after the start of the second act. Much like the passengers on the unsinkable ship would do in 1912, after an iceberg appeared out of nowhere, the patrons of the Iroquois tried to run towards safety. 602 people, including children, died in a nightmarish death. Many of these tragic deaths may have been prevented if just a solid fire safety plan had been in place or the fire exits had not been blocked. Instead, the tragedy went down as the deadliest building disaster in American history until September 11th, 2001. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Andy Roberts. Let's get into it. Reading about the disaster now brings a strong sense of foreboding. The theater designers ignored existing Chicago fire laws that required a stairway and exit for every balcony inside the theater. The Iroquois Theater had only one entrance, and a single broad stairway linked the foyer to the balcony level. The stairway also served as access to another set of stairs leading to the gallery level. Supposedly, the idea behind this was to allow all patrons to be seen upon entering regardless of whether they paid for good seats or not. Furthermore, the theater could hold 1,602 people over 3 audience levels. On the day of the fire, it was packed with nearly 2,000 people. A knowledgeable editor of the local Fireproof magazine toured the shell of the theater while it was under construction. He found and highlighted several problems that were later proven to have contributed to the fire. For one, the theater did not have a stage draft. If it had, most of the smoke would have escaped. For another, there was too much wood trim for a building that had only 6 fire extinguishers. Captain Patrick Jennings, the Chicago Fire Department head at the time, did his own tour of the theater mere days before its opening. Jennings noted that there were no water connections to sprinklers in the building. Even worse, there were no telephones. Jennings reported his concerns, but was told by his commanding officer to stay out of it as the theater had a fireman. Other factors also played a role, and for some, meant the theater should never have opened in the first place. For instance, the opening day for Mr. Bluebeard was delayed several times due to labor unrest and the late submission of architectural drawings. Still, the theater owners pushed for the show to open before the holiday season so that they could make more money. After its opening on November 23rd, the Iroquois pulled small audiences, disappointing the owners who still had dollar signs in their sights. They perked up when, on December 30th, patrons continued filing into the building. Mothers had brought their children and teachers had brought their students to see a funny, classic matinee show. Dan McAvoy starred as the titular Mr. Bluebeard, while Eddie Foy took on the role of Sister Anne. The theater eventually became overcrowded, with people spilling over into the standing room aisles and theater entrance. As the show started its second act to loud applause, a broken arc lamp started sparking. The sparks flew all over, with some of them landing on a stage curtain, setting it on fire. While the second act carried on with a double-octave musical performance, the fire spread upwards across the curtain. The stagehands weren't too concerned until they realized the fire was too high up on the curtain for the fire extinguishers to do their job. The lamp operator, William McMullen, tried to smother the fire, while fireman William Sallers took aim with kill-fire canisters. These measures had no effect, as the fire had already spread to the fly gallery. This gallery was located high above the stage, where the performers were still trying to keep things together. The audience was largely unaware of the fire at this point, but not for long. Thousands of square feet of flammable painted canvas scenery flats hung over the gallery, which would soon be engulfed. By this time, some of the performers lining up to go on stage saw that the fire was getting worse. Eddie Foy later described feeling distraught at the number of mothers and children in the audience. As the burning scenery flats started dropping onto the stage, Foy stepped onto it and pleaded with the audience to stay calm. While he spoke, patrons were trying to flee, too many of them unsuccessfully. Foy's efforts were not successful, in large part due to rising panic of the audience members and because of a stage door opened by the cast and crew. The open door allowed a strong backdraft to feed the flames. There was a short lull in which patrons wondered whether they were overreacting. Then, a massive fireball struck the footlight and leaped onto the velvet curtain. The stage manager saw the imminent danger of overhanging flats and the spreading fire and tried to lower the asbestos fire curtain. The curtain snagged and got stuck because of the light reflector that stuck out from beneath the proscenium arch. It hung a few feet in the air as the stage below collapsed and the lights flickered out. In full panic mode, people started running for the fire exits. Most of them were locked and obscured by long, heavy drapes. As people stopped abruptly in confusion, those following at full speed behind them slammed into them. Panic and fear completely erased all rational thinking, resulting in a 7-foot-high pile of corpses. Those who were still alive tried to climb their way over the macabre pile, only to pass out because of the gas fumes, smoke, and flames. Some died while trying in vain to open windows that looked like doors. Eventually, only 3 doors were forced open, one of them by Frank Houseman, who once played baseball with the Chicago Colts. Another was forcefully opened by Charlie Dexter, who played for the Boston Beaneaters. It is believed a strong blast of air opened the 3rd door. 575 patrons never had a chance of escaping through these 3 doors, including several children. Instead, they died in dead ends and in front of the confusing door windows. 120 fell from the fire escapes, their bodies thudding onto the alley below. Those who ran to the front of the building where they had entered couldn't get out because the entry and exit doors pushed inwards instead of outwards. In addition to the 575 who died at the theatre, 30 more died of severe injuries in the weeks following the tragedy. When firefighters entered what was left of the theatre, it was completely silent. In another eerie parallel to what would happen in the Atlantic Ocean 9 years later, a fire marshal shouted, "Is there any living person here?" He received no answer. Those who perished in the fire died within 15 minutes. That's all it took, 15 minutes, for a short build-up of greed, fire code violations, and warnings to kill hundreds of innocent people. While the mothers, teachers, and children tried to flee, so did the performers and dancers. Most of them were able to escape via the building's rear exit. This exit was a set of double doors used to move scenery and props to and from backstage. These double doors also allowed the fire inside to grow larger and more dangerous as they let in a blast of frigid wind. The air fueled the flames, feeding them as they spread through the theatre. Some of the performers found a way to escape through the windows and even the coal hatch. Others ran to the stage door on the west side, only to find that it also opened inwards. Actors and dancers who followed the leader to the door pressed up against each other and became stuck. While this was happening, the fire continued to rage. The flames bypassed the half-hung asbestos curtain and traveled towards the vents behind the gallery. It instantly destroyed all the flammable materials in this area and killed those trapped in the gallery. As the fire burnt towards the vents, passed over patrons in the orchestra seats, some of these patrons made it to the foyer and eventually outside. Tragically, those stuck behind the wall of corpses in the stairwells would never reach the foyer. Of the performers, a tightrope artist is believed to have perished, while other actors and dancers were injured or lost loved ones. There's also some information about a bit part actor, an usher, and 2 female attendants losing their lives, but their names are not mentioned. There is also an account of aerialist Nellie Reed dying after falling from above the stage. Reed played the role of a fairy and was to fly over the audience, suspended from a trolley wire. When the fire broke out, she remained stuck above the stage, where she was waiting for her entrance. She eventually fell into the fire below and died from burn wounds and other injuries 3 days later. There wasn't even a fire alarm in the Iroquois Theatre. A stagehand had to run to the nearest fire station to alert firefighters. How many lives may have been saved if the firefighters were aware of the blaze earlier? What would the outcome have been if there had been adequate fire exits or no wood trim? Would anyone have died if there had been proper water connections and sprinklers? If someone thought to install enough telephones, would we even be aware of this fire today? The only good thing that came from this tragedy is that regulations started changing the very next day. On New Year's Eve, many theaters cordoned off the standing room. The mayor of Chicago at the time, Carter Harrison, demanded all theaters in the state be closed for 6 weeks. Ironically, Harrison was arrested when it was discovered the city commissioner of buildings never inspected the building. The commissioner also neglected to enforce regulations that would have opened up fire escapes and prepared more extinguishers. Unsurprisingly, Harrison was eventually released without being charged, even though he had been warned a month before the fire that the theater violations were numerous. As a direct result of the fire, many fire laws were enacted over the next few years. These included mandatory exit lights, fire alarms, automatic sprinkler systems, and outward opening doors. The law stated that these doors were not to be locked at any time while the theater was operating. Moreover, there were laws around scenery curtains and props, with the most important being that they had to be fire resistant. One of the most significant laws enacted was the requirement for the mandatory installation of doors that opened outward. They had to be equipped with panic bars that would allow them to be easily opened from the inside during emergencies. This law aimed to prevent the deadly bottlenecks that happened at the Iroquois. Once this law became enforced, it was adopted in public buildings throughout Chicago. Furthermore, regulations stated that theaters had to have fire alarms installed that were connected to local fire stations. If a fire broke out, an automatic sprinkler system could have helped douse the flames while the firefighters were en route. It also became law for exits to be properly marked and illuminated. It was hoped that this would prevent the hysteria that followed when the Iroquois patrons discovered several exits in the theater were fake. Before the theater opened, the staff never participated in a fire drill. As such, laws were introduced mandating emergency training and regular fire drills for all theater staff members. These included ushers and stagehands. Proper fire drills and training enable staff to guide patrons to safety and exit the building themselves. Occupancy limits were enforced soon after the disaster, and the practice of selling standing room only tickets was abolished. Building codes and inspections became the norm, with regulations that included multiple mandatory exits and the installation of fireproof building materials. The Iroquois fire could have and should have been prevented. While the fire safety reforms were absolutely necessary, they should not have been implemented at the cost of 602 innocent lives. The blood of these victims was in the hands of Harry J. Powers and Will J. Davis. But, like Carter Harrison, both Powers and Davis escaped punishment. Both men were individually sued for manslaughter, 575 counts altogether. Their lawyer, Levy Mayer, brought a motion to quash the charges, with more lawyers joining the motion over time. The chief judge of the criminal court, Judge Kirsten, quashed every single indictment and dismissed the common law counts. The case was never heard in Chicago, and the civil part of it went to trial in March 1907 in Vermilion County. Even though more than 100 damages lawsuits were filed, no plaintiff or defendant ever stood before a jury. No single person involved in the disaster was ever held liable. No one even had to pay a fine. Today, the history of the Iroquois Theatre highlights how systemic failures and negligence destroy lives. It brings chaos and catastrophe, and there is no relief for those who suffer as a result. Those who miraculously survived the fire recounted the events afterwards through interviews with several newspapers. One of the survivors, 16-year-old Lila Hazel Coulter, told the Chicago Chronicle that she was seated in the fourth seat from the aisle. She became fascinated at the sight of the fire bursting from both sides of the stage. It took a monumental effort to rush into the aisle away from the fire, where the panicked crowd promptly swept her along. As she was pushed forward, the terrible screams of those dying rang in her ears. She was forced along into the alley, finding herself among a pile of bodies. Realizing she was standing on top of an unconscious young girl, she clambered off and tried to help the girl up. At the same time, women, men, and children were hanging from the theatre platforms, holding on with their hands for dear life. Coulter saw some of them fall into the alley before she ran off to safety. A freshman at OPRF High School, George Leach, was seated in the balcony section when the fire started. Like many of the other patrons, he thought the start of the fire was a light the performers would use in the play. It was only when the burning pieces began falling onto the stage that he fled. Because Leach acted faster than some of the others, he was able to get his coat and hat before leaving the building. He had barely stepped outside when the screaming of the women and children intensified. He stayed and watched as they carried out one body after another once the wounded had been removed from the burning building. In 2005, all that remains of this tragedy are the graves and memorial stones of those who didn't make it out of the burning theatre. That and the memory of the Iroquois Memorial Hospital. The 60-patient hospital officially opened in December 1910. Maud Jackson, who had lost her child via the fire, was the director of the Women's and Children's Department. Honorary President Richard T. Crane Jr. had lost 2 cousins in the tragedy. In 1915, the SS Eastland passenger ship capsized in the Chicago River, killing 844 people. The Iroquois Memorial Hospital treated 250 of these victims. The hospital eventually closed down in 1935 when it no longer received funding from the Chicago City Council. The building was completely demolished in 1951. As we take some time to reflect on the Iroquois Theatre fire, these are the dim sparks of light in an otherwise dark event. The hospital was able to assist other victims, and those who had lost loved ones found some measure of closure in helping others. That said, we must always remember these victims of the theatre fire and how their deaths meant safer buildings for everyone else. We must commit to even better safety measures as we continue to build so that we honor those who died while preventing more tragedies in the future.